attacks. They will bear the consequences for any failure to do so. And so we expected that there would be some sort of retaliatory strike here, which is exactly what we are seeing unfolding. And so, as David mentioned, the question is whether that will be enough to deter future attacks on ships from happening, because, Elaine, we can report that the Houthis have already put out a defiant statement saying that they will continue to target these ships. Of course, they say it's in retaliation for Israeli strikes in Gaza, but there is a coalition of world leaders that say these ships that they are targeting are just commercial vessels that happen to be in the area and have nothing to do with the conflict.
Well, Weijia, what about more broadly here? At the beginning of this segment, we spoke with retired Ambassador Gerald Firestein, who said this is certainly unfortunate in his view, given the tension in the region and the Biden administration not appearing to want to keep tensions as much as possible to a minimum. How concerned is the White House now about a wider conflict?
Well, from day one, that has been a primary concern, because they do not want the U.S. and U.S. troops dragged into this conflict. And so at the same time, they've also warned that if there were would-be actors who are waiting to seize on the chaos, on the conflict that we are watching in Gaza, then there would be consequences and there would, be actions taken. Now, at the time, we tried to press the administration about what that meant, about how far they were willing to go. And of course, not surprisingly, they did not talk about any possibilities of responses. But now we are seeing one. And of course, this isn't the first time either that we've seen a retaliatory strike. But the concern, Elaine, is that it's not just these ships, but just today there was a Greek oil tanker that was seized by Iran in the Gulf of Oman. And right now, we still don't know the status of that crew. So there are broader concerns, to your point, about the escalations that are happening and what this could mean about, having a back and forth of these sorts of attacks. So, Elaine, the administration has made clear that they do not want this conflict to expand. But, of course, it's not just up to them, and we have to see how the Houthis respond to this strike.
And would you remind us of Secretary of State Antony Blinken's trip to the region, because he visited Israel, he met with Israeli leaders. We saw him speak, as I said earlier, about potential consequences here. What was that sort of stated mission for Antony Blinken?
Well, Elaine, this has been an ongoing effort, not only to send that message, but to try to de-escalate and have Israel move on to the next phase of the war, to see if they are in fact doing everything that they can to reduce the number of civilian casualties, to continue the work that they are doing to bring hostages home. And so, you're right, this is one of many trips that he has taken to just try to relay that message. But because of what we were seeing unfolding in the Red Sea, again, he was issuing a warning that what we are seeing happening right now, would be the case. And so even though he didn't explicitly say that there would be an airstrike, again, what's happening, what's unfolding is not a surprise.
And Weijia, we know that the Houthi forces have been using Iranian intelligence and weapons in these attacks against these commercial vessels. Remind us of what the Biden administration's policy was towards Iran prior to the war between Israel and Hamas, and the posture that the Biden administration had towards Iran. There were concerns about Iran and uranium enrichment. And it was something that I know the Biden administration early on was focused on making a deal with the Iranians. Remind us of that broader context.
Yeah, so this is a very difficult thing to navigate for the Biden administration, because they need Iran to use its influence to influence groups that are backed by Iran, like the Houthis, to try to stop the widening, the escalation of this war. But certainly, as you mentioned, there has been years of conflict because of Iran's nuclear ambitions. And the concern is that Iran could continue to fund these groups who have malign motives to get involved and to force this conflict to broaden out. And so I do remember distinctly, I'm sure you do too, that at the start of the conflict in Gaza, the president said multiple times very clearly to Iran not to get involved in any capacity. And at, around the same time, a few weeks prior, the U.S. did unfreeze Iranian assets, to be clear, that had that were frozen. They were not U.S. taxpayer monies, but they were able to reach a deal that allowed Iran to access about $6 billion for humanitarian reasons only. And so they received a lot of Republican criticism that now, the U.S. is allowing Iran to access this money that had been frozen to then, distribute for the escalation of this war, which is just not true, according to administration officials who are closely tracking that money. And so it is very complicated, Elaine, because I'm sure, as you remember, this dates all the way back to the Obama administration and the efforts to try to curb Iran's nuclear ambitions. And when the Trump administration came on and dismantled the agreement with Iran, there were so many open-ended questions that remain about how this administration is going to tackle that. And it is an ongoing effort which only complicates anything that Iranian-backed groups like the Houthis are doing.
All right, Weijia Jiang in our Washington bureau. Weijia, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Let's go back to retired Ambassador Gerald Firestein right now. He is a distinguished senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. Mr. Ambassador, give us a bit more of the context here when it comes to Iran. What kind of control do we understand they have when it comes to the groups using the resources, using the intelligence, using the weapons in these proxy groups? How much control is there by Iran? Do we know?
Well, with the Houthis, that, of course, has been a question that people have been asking for a decade now, of whether or not the Houthis, whether the Iranians could direct the Houthis to stop or to start or to do whatever. I think the reality is, again, at least as far as the Houthis are concerned, that while they coordinate with Iran, and certainly the Iranians have provided them with a great deal of support over the years, the Houthis have their own goals and objectives. And while they need to listen very carefully to what the Iranians say to them, the Iranians don't control them. They can't tell them that they want them to stop the attacks or to do other things. The Houthis are responding to what they consider their own domestic imperatives. And support for the Palestinians in opposition to Israel is something that goes very well with many Yemenis, including many Yemenis who don't like the Houthis.
Yeah, because I guess what I'm wondering as well is it in Iran's interest for there to be an escalation of this kind at this point?
Well, again, it's a good question. And I think the assumption has been up until now that neither the Iranians nor some of its closest allies like Hezbollah really want to see the fighting escalate. They don't want to make this into a regional conflict. But with the Houthis, it may be a little bit different. The Houthis are far away from the situation. There is a certain level of deniability on the part of the Iranians over what the Houthis might be doing, and therefore they may believe that they can allow the Houthis to proceed with these attacks without crossing U.S. red lines that would mean a direct U.S.-Iranian confrontation.
And Mr. Ambassador, I wonder what diplomatic avenues, if any, are available right now? Are there any places, any other moderators in the region who might get involved at this point?
Well, outside of Iran, the country in the region that has the greatest influence on the Houthis is Oman. The Houthis maintain an office in Muscat, in the Omani capital, and they have been very close to the Houthis over a number of years, have mediated a number of different issues and agreements with the Houthis over the years. So the Omanis might have some influence. And the other thing that's going on, of course, is again, in terms of the Yemen civil war, in which the Houthis are the main combatant. They've been engaged in negotiations with Saudi Arabia for quite a long time, trying to bring an end to that conflict. And the Saudis also are in regular touch with the Houthis and might have some ability to bring the two issues, the Yemen civil war and these Red Sea attacks, together in one negotiation.
All right, retired Ambassador Gerald Firestein, thank you very much for sharing your analysis with us.
Pleasure.
If you are just joining us, it is 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 out west. I'm Elaine Quijano. We are following breaking news. The United States and the United Kingdom have carried out strikes on Houthi rebels in Yemen. Now, this comes after the Iranian-backed militia group attacked cargo ships and tankers in the Red Sea. There have been more than 24 attacks since October. For more, our national security correspondent David Martin joins us now by phone from the Pentagon. David, what do we know about these strikes?
Well, we know they were conducted against multiple targets inside Yemen. The Houthis have been firing drones, and they've been firing ballistic missiles, and they've been firing cruise missiles. All of them have a return address. They were launched from some location inside Yemen, and those would be the most likely targets. Now, the Houthis have known that this strike was coming. They've been warned about it. These launchers are mobile so that they can move them around. So it is not clear exactly how many sites the U.S. was able to locate and then strike accurately. And one other target would be the radars, which the Houthis use to guide the missiles as they're en route to the shipping lanes in the Red Sea.
David, is it clear at this point, or do United States officials have a sense of where the command and control aspect of this comes from? Is it within the Houthis themselves? Is there a sense that Iran has the ability to direct some of this activity?
The belief is that they don't so much direct as enable. When ships are going to and from the Suez Canal and the Red Sea, all they are blips on your radar. You don't know which ship belongs to which country. Mm-hmm. And for 3 years now, the Iranians have had in the Red Sea what they call an auxiliary ship and what most people would call a spy ship. And it is there for the purpose of identifying ships that pass through the Suez Canal, and it passes some of that information on to the Houthis. Whether they say, okay, attack that ship at such and such a time, in U.S. eyes, really doesn't matter because without Iran, the assumption is that the Houthis would not be able to keep these attacks up, not only because Iran is providing the intelligence, but Iran is also providing the weapons that are being used in these attacks.
And David, do we know what kind of actual weapons the United States, the UK, what is assembled there in the region, in the Red Sea? We know they had been increasing the presence there in response to the increased activity by the Houthis Do we know what's there now?
Well, there were a total of 5 ships. There was the aircraft carrier Eisenhower, which of course has attack aircraft on it, and then there were 1 cruiser and 3 destroyers, and they were all patrolling in the southern Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. And all of those other ships, the aircraft carrier has its strike fighters. All those other ships have land attack cruise missiles, which are capable of reaching any target inside Houthi-controlled territory, and they fly low and are very very hard to intercept, and over the years have become very accurate at recognizing the targets. So the intent here was obviously to carry out pinpoint strikes against a number of targets inside Yemen. It is the early morning hours in Yemen, and the purpose of that is to keep civilian casualties to a minimum.
That was going to be my question, David, on the timing of this. Was there any indication why now? Why these strikes at this point?
Well, if you remember, it was about a week ago that the U.S. issued what it said was its final warning, and that if the attacks continued, the Houthis would have to bear the consequences. And it seemed like the U.S. was on the verge of attacking last week. And then everything seemed to come to a halt. The Houthi attacks went into a lull. There was only 1 attack immediately following that warning. But I think also what happened was that the U.S. looked at all the things that were happening in the Middle East in that particular time. As you remember, there was the bombing of that crowd in Iran. There was an Israeli drone strike against a senior Hamas leader in Beirut, and there was an American drone strike against a senior militia leader in Baghdad. And the feeling was that there was just too much going on. We were losing control of the situation, and sort of this thing was about to boil over. And there was a decision just to slow down, take a few deep breaths, and then the attacks started coming again with greater numbers of drones and greater numbers of missiles, and probably more importantly, in more sophisticated attacks. It's one thing just to lob missiles out into the shipping lanes. That's hazard enough. But the U.S. intelligence can recognize a complex attack in which drones are used to pick out the targets. Drones are used as decoys to allow missiles to get through. And this last series of attacks launched by the Houthis were what the U.S. calls a complex attack, one designed not just to harass, but to do real damage. And I think the U.S. officials and British officials decided they just couldn't wait any longer. They had to make good on their threat to punish the Houthis if they ignored the warning.
All right, David Martin at the Pentagon for us. David, thank you.
Good thing.
Let's bring in CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang. She is in our Washington, D.C. bureau. So, Weijia, remind us, what has the Biden administration been saying about retaliation? Was this expected?
Yeah, Elaine, this strike is not surprising because they issued a warning along with other countries last week that if the Houthis continued their attacks, on commercial shipping, then there would be consequences. And that's exactly what we saw unfold today. In fact, just today, the White House reiterated that message from the podium at the White House from a spokesman who said that the Houthis must stop. And so right now I'm checking to make sure we have not missed a statement from the White House. And so far they have not issued one, or one from President Biden regarding the airstrikes. But again, they said that there would be action taken. And we know that this week, the Houthis continued their assault on these ships in the Red Sea. And so, this is, again, what we expected to happen, although we did not know the extent, the details of how it would play out.
Weijia, how concerned has the White House been about a wider conflict?
They have been very concerned, Elaine, from day one, and that is exactly why they have gone to great lengths to warn proxies of Iran, to warn potential would-be actors not to get involved, not to try to seize on the chaos of this conflict. But what's interesting is that a Democrat, Congressman Ro Khanna of California, he just tweeted to say that the president needs to come to Congress before launching a strike against the Houthis in Yemen and involving us in another Middle East conflict. And so that is a Democrat who is just now voicing concerns about this strike. But again, we have not heard directly from the White House and certainly not responding to this allegation from Congressman Ro Khanna.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you can answer this, Weijia, but, given that statement and the complexities that we have been seeing when it comes to the Israel-Hamas conflict, what could we see here in the United States? This is a presidential campaign season that we're in now. Is this something that we could see the candidates actually discuss and perhaps point to when it comes to foreign policy?
Well, certainly President Biden is already talking about why in this moment his decades of experience in foreign policy is critical. And there are a lot of questions about how Republican candidates would not only handle the conflict in the Middle East, but whether they would continue to try to fund Ukraine as it continues its war against Russia. And so it is a critical topic, Elaine, that again, this administration is already using to frame why Joe Biden is the right president for this moment. So it's unclear how the other Republican candidates would be responding to this, but certainly, yes, to your point, it will continue to be an important issue for the 2024 election.
All right, Weijia Jiang in our Washington bureau. Weijia, thank you.
Sure.
CBS News White House reporter Willie Inman joins us now. So, Willie, I know this is still ongoing. What do we know right now about any potential White House response? Has there been any kind of statement yet regarding these strikes?
Hey there, Elaine. Well, no statement yet from the White House. And the White House did what's called, they called a lid, essentially meaning that we're not going to see the president of the United States for the rest of the night. We do, of course, know that a U.S. official confirmed that the U.S. and the U.K. carried out these strikes in Yemen in response to these Houthi attacks that have been happening in the Red Sea. It was earlier this week and yet in today, in fact, that John Kirby, an NSC spokesperson, had repeated those warnings that the U.S. and its allies would retaliate for these actions in the Red Sea, which is a very important shipping lane. You have a lot of shipping traffic, and that, of course, is a concern for this administration and other U.S. allies and partners. But it looks like the U.S. is carrying out its response, carrying out that threat of a response if the Houthis continue these attacks. It was just last week that they gave that final warning, so to speak. And then you had an attack again, a sophisticated attack coming from the Houthis, which the U.S. has said Iran is essentially at blame here in terms of what's going on there in the Middle East. But clearly, the White House responding tonight with that strike, but we don't yet have a statement, at least, coming from the President of the United States tonight.
I'm wondering, Willie, if during that briefing where John Kirby spoke, as well as Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, there was anything that would indicate why there might be this strike now, why these strikes now? I know there was a question posed about a red line being crossed, and maybe that's the threshold. Was there anything in that conversation that would suggest that there was, in fact, some kind of threshold that had been crossed that would result in the kind of attacks that we're seeing now?
And listening to Kirby over the past several days, one of the things he said in the briefing, I believe it was yesterday as well, he essentially said that lives could have been lost, that thankfully there was no damage to these ships in the Red Sea, that the U.S. military responded in kind to take out these elements coming from the Houthis. And one of the things he often says, and the White House will often say as well, is that they don't want to telegraph their punches, so to speak. But this, of course, is a major punch, a major blow to the Houthis in Yemen. It's something that the U.S. didn't necessarily telegraph that they were going to do. But as time went on and the situation got more dangerous, you're seeing now that the U.S. and the U.K. Are responding in this situation.
Do we know at this point, you said the White House had called a lid, effectively suggesting we would not see the president at any point. It has happened in the past where they have lifted lids, but no indication yet. Willie, anything crossing your email that would suggest otherwise?
No indication yet. We have my White House colleague, Bo Erickson, is working his sources there at the White House trying to confirm some details about if we'll see a statement or if we'll see the president himself speak, but nothing yet as of now. Elaine, and as you pointed out, sometimes they do oftentimes call that lid back. They call the press back to the White House. But as of now, we yet don't have a statement and we don't have any word as to whether we'll hear from the president in a paper statement or in front of cameras tonight from the White House.
All right, Willie Inman. Willie, thank you so much. Let's go to our Nancy Cordes now at the White House. Nancy, what more can you tell us? Do we know, first of all, whether members of Congress or congressional leaders were made aware that these strikes were planned?
Well, we do, Elaine. In fact, CBS News just confirmed that the Biden administration briefed members of congressional leadership earlier today about plans to strike these targets. So so-called Gang of Eight, those 8 key congressional leaders that are typically tipped off to strikes like this. It sounds like they were tipped off once again today. They were informed by Biden administration officials. That comes from a source familiar with these briefings. We are waiting, as Willie said, more information from the White House, from the Pentagon. I anticipate we will get more details about the targets that were struck, what kinds of U.S. aircraft, perhaps naval craft were involved in these strikes. But what we do know right now is that these were joint strikes by the U.S. and the U.K., but that there were a number of other nations that are assisting, including Canada and Australia. And that's a key aspect of this whole operation. I heard you talking earlier about the fact that why now, after we've seen dozens of strikes by these Houthis over the past couple of months? Was there a particular threshold that was crossed? Well, one of the thresholds was that the U.S. was basically building a coalition with other nations, both to speak out and condemn what they were seeing, these Houthi strikes against commercial shipping, but also a coordinated warning to the Houthis that if they didn't change their tactics, that there might be a coordinated response. And, that warning came out last week from 12 nations, including the U.S. and the U.K. And so it's not surprising that now, a week later, you're starting to see these coordinated responses.
And remind us, Nancy, of the kind of factors that went into considering a strike like this, given the Houthis' reliance upon Iranian intelligence, the use of Iranian weapons, the very precarious situation that exists right now. What were the factors that the Biden administration was taking into account as they weighed this decision?
Well, obviously, there's this ongoing concern, Elaine, about the Israel-Hamas conflict broadening and growing, not only to spread to other countries within the region, but also to pull the UN, possibly other nations, in as well. So that's a factor, and that is something that White House officials, Pentagon officials consider very carefully when deciding whether to strike. As you pointed out, the Houthis are backed by Iran. The missiles and the drones that they've been using to strike commercial ships, those come from Iran. And it may be that the U.S. felt that this is a way to send a message to Iran, but not by striking Iran itself, which would certainly broaden this conflict, but by striking an ally, these Houthis in Yemen. And keep in mind that they're watching not just what the Houthis are doing, but what the Iranians are doing as well. Just today, the Iranians seized a Greek vessel in the Gulf of Oman that was, again, just like all these other commercial ships, just traversing the area. An oil tanker that was on its way to Turkey. And the Iranian military seized that vessel. The Iranian military boarded the vessel, and right now the fate of the crew members on that vessel is unknown. So these, by all accounts, major strikes that took place tonight in Yemen are clearly designed to send a message to Iran about what could happen if they continue to back these strikes by the Houthis, by other rebels who are based in Iran, based in Iraq, based in Syria, against the United States and its allies.
Nancy, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, just visited the region there. And I'm wondering if the U.S. has any kind of leverage at all with respect to the Houthis in particular. Given the domestic civil war that's happening in Yemen, I wonder, are there any diplomatic possibilities for a resolution?
Diplomacy with the Houthis has never been all that successful. They are viewed as a rebel group. They were, in fact, on a list of terrorists in the U.S. They dropped off that list, but White House officials say that that's now being reconsidered and that they could possibly be reclassified. So, so those talks are difficult ones. And, clearly the fact that the Houthis continue to barrage these commercial ships, which, an international coalition has been warning them, hey, these ships have nothing to do with the Israel-Hamas conflict. They are simply delivering goods throughout the region. You need to leave them alone. The fact that the Houthis ignored those admonishments and basically said, no, we see this as retaliation for Israel striking Gaza, that is a grave concern. And by the way, Elaine, even before these new U.S.-UK strikes were carried out tonight, there was widespread knowledge that they were likely to happen. The UK cabinet met. There was reporting out of the UK that the UK Prime Minister had signed off on the strikes. And the Houthis put out a statement that was very defiant, saying they're not going to change a thing. They're going to continue to strike these commercial vessels because they view it as retribution for what's happening in Gaza.
Certainly seems like there is not much possibility of a diplomatic solution given that tone. And so, Nancy, any indication just in the last few minutes as we've been speaking that there might be a statement or some kind of word from the White House as these strikes are going on now? I know this is still developing. And as Willie said a moment ago, the White House had called a lid, meaning we're not expecting to see the president. But anything that you're seeing, Nancy, that suggests we may be hearing, at least in a paper statement, some kind of response from the president?
I think it's very likely that we'll get a paper statement either from the president or the Pentagon or both. It's possible we'll get some kind of background call later tonight with more details about these strikes. That's pretty typical when something like this happens. Certainly, our British counterparts will be getting more details from the UK government as well, so we'll be monitoring that. I think it's unlikely that we would see the president himself tonight, that he would come out and give some kind of address. But I do think that, once the dust has settled, once these strikes have wrapped up, that we'll start to get more details from the Pentagon and the White House.
All right, Nancy Cortez at the White House for us. Nancy, as always, we thank you.
You got it.
Nader Hashemi joins me now. He's a professor of Middle East and Islamic politics at Georgetown University. Professor, thanks very much for being with us. First of all, your reaction to these strikes.
Well, we sort of had an indication that they were coming. There was, warnings by the United States and its allies that if the Houthis didn't stop these attacks in the Red Sea, that the United States would have to ratchet up the pressure. It doesn't come as a big surprise. I think the core sort of instigating factor here that has brought us to this crisis moment is the war in Gaza. The United States does not want to, put any constraints on Israel as it tries to reach its war aims in Gaza. And there are consequences to that policy. And one of the consequences is it produces regional destabilization. Those forces in the region that at least have a sympathy or solidarity with Palestinian suffering are claiming that they're not going to stand idly by and watch what many people in the region consider to be, an act of genocide take place. And so they're responding accordingly. And of course, the last observation that I'd make very quickly is U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East has completely unraveled here. Just a few months ago, the United States was claiming this was a very stable part of the region. They were celebrating normalization agreements, hoping to get the Saudis and the Israelis to come together. And now it looks like we're on the precipice of a major escalation and possible regional war.
So let me ask you a bit more about that. For the Houthis, as you say, this is not unexpected. There had been warnings. We had heard U.S. officials talk about consequences repeatedly if the Houthis did not stop their attacks on these shipping vessels. To what end? What appears to be the objective here for the Houthis?
Well, they've stated explicitly that this is about the war in Gaza. If there's a ceasefire in Gaza, if there is some radical transformation of the direction of that war, then they will stop their attacks. Now, we don't know if that's true, but there is some evidence to suggest that it might be true because during the ceasefire that existed in Gaza that allowed for the exchange of hostages, there was a reduction in attacks by the Houthis and other elements backed by Iran. It would take some serious diplomacy, I think, to sort of work out the details. But I think it's certainly worth exploring, and it's much better than heading in the direction that we're currently heading in, which seems like, a military escalation here. And we don't know how this is going to end.
Yeah, let me follow up. How realistic do you think a diplomatic solution is in pursuing one right now?
I think it's worth trying. I mean, one of the problems here is that the United States obviously doesn't talk to some of the key players, but the United States has allies in the region, particularly the Qataris, who have good relations with all sides, could perhaps pursue the type of diplomacy that many people would like to see, but it would take a lot of intense negotiations. And I think the dilemma here for the Biden administration is they're caught between a rock and a hard place. They don't want to put constraints on Israel's military campaign, but by making that decision, that sort of creates a response in the region. If we can understand how after October the 7th, many people in the West deeply sympathized and were angry over what happened to Israeli civilians, and they were sympathetic to Israel's response in Gaza, at least initially. We can also understand the reverse of that equation, or the opposite side of that equation, how people in the Arab Islamic world are looking at this horror show in Gaza, and they're outraged as well, and they're responding. And I think we're seeing some of that response that has produced this crisis moment.
So given those dynamics that you just spelled out, Professor, what would you anticipate here? Sort of these strikes that are retaliatory, clearly, in response to the actions of the Houthis. being sort of a one-time thing or being a more prolonged effort?
Well, it depends on how the Houthis respond. They say they're going to respond. I think they do have assets. What I'm thinking about is, and your listeners will remember this, the Saudis were bombing the Houthis for a good 6-7 years, very intensely with American weapons. It created a lot of outrage. It was, one of the worst humanitarian disasters at the time. The Houthis withstood that punishment, and they emerged stronger. Of course, they had backing by Iran. I don't see the United States being able to solve this problem through bombing, particularly against the Houthis, who have quite a bit of battlefield experience with these types of things. So the danger here is, we go up the escalatory ladder, and they're going to respond, and the United States is going to have to up the ante. And before you know it, we're in a situation where, we're looking at a Middle East war. So I think this is the time for diplomacy. I don't think the Biden administration really, wants a broader regional war, but they're in many ways, they want to be loyal to their Israeli ally and give them time to achieve their war aims. But that, as I said a moment ago, produces consequences throughout the region. So the United States is going to have to figure out what it wants to do here to avoid what looks like the direction that we're heading in, and that's a possible broader regional Middle Eastern war.
Professor, when you first heard this news, perhaps not surprising, as we've been talking about, given the kinds of warnings that we've been hearing from U.S. officials, what would be the response, you think, for Israeli officials who are seeing these developments? They are prosecuting their own war. They have their own agenda. Is there any indication that this kind of potential for further escalation might be enough to produce a diplomatic breakthrough on that front when it comes to Israel and Hamas?
I don't think so, because I think the Israelis are very concerned that the Houthis are sort of, poking at the West, at the world economy, where it's very vulnerable. The Red Sea, the Suez Canal. It knows that the United States does not want to see, the global economy be affected by these by ships that are passing through this part of the Middle East. And I think the Israelis would be very worried if the United States were to then, as a result, put pressure on Israel to limit its war aims or to, impose a ceasefire. I'm reading what I'm seeing in Washington is the United States still wants to have it both ways. It wants to give Israel as much time as it needs to achieve its war aims in Gaza, notwithstanding the, horrific humanitarian suffering that we're seeing. And at the same time, it wants to ensure that, other actors in the region don't respond and sort of demonstrate and flex their muscle, as we're seeing the Houthis doing and in Iran doing and other countries doing as well. So I don't see this producing a diplomatic settlement. I think it's going to require something much bigger. It's going to fundamentally require, I think, on the part of the United States, really a recalculation of its Mideast policy post October the 7th. If it's going to continue down the path that it's on, supporting Israel until it's achieved its war aims in Gaza, well, then it's going to have to also, I think, deal with the repercussions and the consequences of that policy. And that's these, attacks by the Houthis and other Iranian-backed militia who are going to be flexing their muscle as well. There's other things that we could talk about. I think this is, we're headed in a very dangerous direction. There's been, attacks in Damascus against Iranian targets in southern Lebanon and also in Beirut. And so I think in many ways, the Iranians are very happy to see the Houthis sort of push back at the Americans. This also, I think, is connected to the seizing of the oil tanker today. So this is all a very messy picture. And, there's a deeper history to this, but I think the trigger of this crisis is very much the war in Gaza. And that's something the United States is going to have to own because they're Israel's biggest backer. And so in many ways, they have sort of set the stage for what we're seeing unfolding before our eyes.
As you point out, an incredibly complicated landscape. Nader Hashemi, thank you very much, Professor, for sharing your analysis and insight with us.
Thanks.
Still to come, more on the White House response to this escalation in the Red Sea. We'll be back after a quick break. You're streaming CBS News.
It's like a screenplay, something straight out of Hollywood.
Human remains
was found this week.
The mystery would haunt investigators for years.
A gripping true crime original, 48 Hours, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
AI is among the most world-changing technologies ever.
Curing diseases, scientific breakthroughs, making lives better.
They can help us with medical discoveries, scientific discoveries, doing better agriculture, having cures for things like Alzheimer's.
It's also going to really transform the way we work.
The uplifting potential of artificial intelligence is limitless.
It gives you a friend, somebody to chat with 24/7 that is non-judgmental. He makes me feel loved and desired.
And so are its downfalls.
The problem with all this AI is that it's unpredictable and uncontrollable. The choices we make now will have lasting effects for decades, maybe even centuries.
The ChatGPT revolution, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Well, let me start with this.
This really happened.
Have you told the government?
Did any of that make sense?
What's your response?
You want me to just
What's
keep
wrong
going?
with that argument?
What have you
Do
learned?
you know why?
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 It's time for 60 Minutes, Sunday on CBS.
He was there when the war in Ukraine started.
Extreme history. It's a big moment.
The extraordinary story behind Sean Penn's new Paramount Plus documentary, Superpower, when we go person to person.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
You had a substitute teacher that was pretty popular. What was his reputation?
Everyone loved him.
You had to miss a test. What did he offer to have you make up the test?
He said that I can come by after school was all over and just take the exam. The blinds were down. He closed the door. The next thing I knew, he was right next to me. That's when I realized what was going to happen. Even if I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs, no one would hear me because no one was there. He told me that if I ever said anything to anyone, he would kill me and he would kill my family. So I did it.
Pledge of Silence, now streaming on the free CBS News app. An original documentary from CBS reports.
Since you started La Soup in 2014, do you have any sense as to how much food you've rescued from the landfill?
We've rescued 4.5 million pounds.
I can't even fathom how much food that is.
And that's one little person in one little city in America. We're going to call this chicken piccata. We did 450 of these meals today.
This is the exact dish that you and I are going to have.
Yep.
Oh, my God.
Is it good? Mm-hmm. Having a plan of how to keep people fed should be in every single city.
So if we eliminated food waste, could we eliminate
hunger? Yes.
Eating Trash, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
I'm Elaine Quijano. Back to our top story. The United States and the United Kingdom have carried out airstrikes on Houthi rebels in Yemen. This comes after the Iranian-backed militia group attacked cargo ships and tankers in the Red Sea. There have been more than 24 attacks since October. Our Nancy Cordes joins us now from the White House. Nancy, what is the very latest that you're hearing there?
Elaine, we just got a lengthy statement from the President of the United States laying out the scope of these strikes, the rationale for these strikes. And I'm just going to walk you through it because I've got it here on my phone and we are just going through it ourselves. He says, today, at my direction, U.S. military forces, together with the United Kingdom and with support from Australia, Bahrain, Canada, and the Netherlands. I think it's notable that Bahrain assisted here, another Middle East nation, successfully conducted strikes against a number of targets in Yemen used by Houthi rebels to endanger freedom of navigation in one of the world's most vital waterways. He says that these strikes are in direct response to Houthi attacks on international maritime vessels. In other words, they are not attacking military vessels. They are simply attacking commercial vessels that are transporting oil, natural gas, and other goods through the Red Sea. He says that they have endangered U.S. personnel, civilian mariners, and jeopardized trade. Here's another interesting point. He says more than 50 nations have been affected in 27 attacks on international shipping, and more than 2,000 ships have been forced to divert thousands of miles to avoid the Red Sea because of these attacks. Here is something that I find really fascinating. He says that the Houthis launched the first ever anti-ship ballistic missile. And that is why these nations decided to strike Yemen, and specifically the Houthis in Yemen. He says they're in direct response to these unprecedented attacks, including the use of anti-ship ballistic missiles for the first time in history. So basically what he's saying here, Elaine, is that these attacks by the Houthis that we have been cataloging over the last few months, 27 of them so far on commercial shipping, are unprecedented, and they are putting dozens of nations, thousands of commercial vessels and their crews at risk. And this is the response, these major strikes by the U.S. and the U.K., assisted, not militarily, but obviously logistically, by 4 other nations tonight.
And Nancy, you noted at the top that among the countries that is listed as carrying out this action or joining together with the United States is the nation of Bahrain. Why is that particularly significant?
Well, it's interesting because the Secretary of State was just in Bahrain yesterday. As you know, for months he's been hopscotching through a variety of Middle Eastern nations, conducting diplomatic talks. When he was in Bahrain yesterday, Elaine, he made a point of saying that the U.S. is going to have a response at the time and place of its choosing because of all of these strikes on commercial vessels. And by the way, a lot of these commercial vessels are not U.S. vessels. They are owned and operated by any number of countries. The U.S. did spearhead a coalition of about 20 nations to send military vessels to the region to sort of guard these commercial ships as they traverse the region. But it is by no means only the U.S. that is coming under attack here. And so he issued that warning to the Houthis. And now a day later, the U.S. and the U.K. have made good on those warnings.
All right, CBS News Chief White House Correspondent Nancy Cordes. Nancy, thank you.
You're welcome.
Now to our other top stories of the day. We have been following 2 legal cases, one involving Donald Trump, the other President Biden's son, Hunter. On Thursday, the 2 men appeared in courtrooms on opposite sides of the country. Donald Trump for closing arguments in his civil fraud trial in New York, and Hunter Biden to plead not guilty to federal tax charges in